in some parts, I think the presentation will be conceptual, because it's a very new avenue of study, scientifically and design. And so I hope you can bear with me, and then I think let's make sense of things together as we go along, and then we can have more of an open discussion afterwards, after the presentation. So I kind of want to just give a general outline of kind of more or less what you can expect from the presentation. I'll start off by talking about the concept of the world, and then go into world building, and then I'll talk about colonialism, coloniality, decolonial technology, and then hopefully give some kind of a technical demo of something that is from my creative practice. So I want to start talking about like the idea of this world, the idea of the world, And I think like when most times when we think about the world, this is kind of like what we think about, We think about that's the world, But I think this kind of notion that this might be world, but slightly misleading, because this is actually the Earth, This is a geological interstellar body that's suspended in space or ether, whatever you want to call it. So it's more of also a geological feature. That's not the world, at least. That's not how it's more deeply considered. The world looks something like this, The world is really just the interconnected relations of all of these things that may inhabit a planet like Earth. So it's the interactions between things like animals, value systems, times, culture, knowledge, geography, environments, and people. And this world, whereas the other world is created like, I don't know if you're a creationist or whatever religious position you could take, but of course, the other world is created by, let's say, forces that we are still to determine. Who created that? The Earth. This world is created by mostly humans within this cluster of agents who exercise different levels of power. So I guess once you understand that, you can understand that depending on who's exercising power in this system of the world, at different time in the human history, they have predominantly created worlds and controlled what the world is, because their actions, of course, have power dynamics or are influenced by differences in power. So in talking about the world, I want to go on further, talk about the idea of like world building. So world building as defined by John Hamilton, which is kind of like, this style of quoting is actually something that I try to avoid, but it's a process of constructing a world, originally an imaginary one, sometimes associated with a fictional world. And then Trent says, developing imaginary setting with coherent qualities such as history, geography, ecology. World building often involves the creation of geography, a backstory, flora, fauna, inhabitants, technology, different races, social customs, as well as invented languages. And so when we start to understand that this is kind of like how worlds are built, that even within considering the world that of the diagram that I showed before, it is first imagined and then sort of kind of implemented. So maybe it's useful if I give examples of other worlds that exist, because of course there have been other worlds between the ones that there have not been other Earths. This is also where you start to see the distinction. There have been other worlds before the one that we live in, right now, and there will most likely be other worlds after this one. And this is where you also start to understand that we have agency in creating that world. And world building is really that agency. So I don't know how many of you recognize this specific world, but this world is from Game of Thrones, you know, which is like a popular TV show, of course. I think that's kind of based on a sort of post-medieval reading of modern-day Europe. So it's not completely, it's imagined, but of course it's imagined based on that basis. But the thing about the Game of Thrones world that's so convincing is that it has all those characteristics of a world. It has specific animals, dragons. It has specific languages, High Valerian and the other languages. It has different races. It has different currencies. It has different geography. And this is what makes it compelling as a world. And I have a kind of thesis that the reason that Middle Earth from Lord of the Rings and maybe Game of Thrones are so compelling worlds and so believable and persuasive worlds, it's exactly because they have those things figured out: geography, history, languages. And I think that's what it takes to make a world. And so then I want to kind of depart from this more fictitious, but debatable, this idea of like the Game of Thrones world to a world that we know that's kind of more familiar to us. And this is another world, or a representation of a part of another world that we know. And here you can say, okay, this is the real world, right? And these are real borders. But of course, those borders were also created again by certain exercising of power differentials. You know, the borders that you see around most countries weren't always that way. They were created during a specific period of time, and that's when, that's why this world looks like that. So we can't talk about this world really without talking about colonialism, you know, which is kind of like it's weird because it's kind of both the like hot buzz, hot word these days, but it's also the most dreadful, dreary kind of word to bring up. So of course, colonialism, as maybe some of you know, sort of created. I would like to say that European colonialism, because there are also other kinds of colonialisms that existed, you know, like the Mongol Empire in a way had certain constellations of a sort of federation with a capital. And I don't want to get ahead of myself in talking about how worlds are configured in a colonial world. But yeah, there are other colonialisms that existed. But there is one colonialism that we speak of when we speak of colonialism, and that one is European colonialism, you know, that started within the early 14th century until around the 1960s, when European powers perpetuated a territorial appropriation, exploitation of natural environments and human labor to take direct control of social structures. And the one that's kind of like much closer to what we're thinking about is, of course, colonization, or at least in Namibia and kind of like in Africa, the colonialism that unravels after what is called the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers met under the patronage of Otto von Bismarck and continued to, or started to carve up Africa into different territories. As you can see, the fine gentleman over there pointing to a map of Africa that doesn't have the colonial borders that we associate with the continent today. And so this kind of like this colonization of the world is kind of what is responsible for, I think, this specific state or instance of the world that we're living in right now. And so, according to philosophers like Dussel, there's this idea that European colonialism exists in a constellation or a configuration of a core and a periphery. Within the core, it is Europe. Europe is the core. And this is the zone of where sort of humans live and civilization lives and higher like ideals live. And on the periphery, that is where everyone else lives. So mostly Asia and Africa and some parts of the Middle East and Southern America as well. So that is the periphery. I mean, the idea we talk about for instance, the idea of like, something that I often think about when I go back to the idea of world building is like we talk about global north and global south. I mean, you look at, for instance, like Australia. Geographically, Australia is not in the north, but it's considered as a northern a part of the global north, like despite its kind of like geographic position. And I think that also adds to this idea of world building being more of a conceptual thing that's sort of enacted and that's practiced through a system of colonialism. Yeah, so this is just Dussell's kind of like representation of what the colonial world looks like, is where you have a core and then you have a periphery that's kind of like on the outside. And so maybe it helps for me to say the other thing about the colonial, this configuration of having a core and a periphery, is that you have a core, which is the metropole or the capital, and then you have the colonies. And the only purpose of the colonies is to feed the core, and so the relationship between the core and the periphery is almost one of like an imbalanced, unequal exploitation. They have an extraction of resources, of human labor, of natural environments for the periphery in order to feed the development and the appetites of the core. But that things like quality of life and things like advancements rarely make it to the periphery. And if you think of Namibia or Africa in general as being part of the periphery, you can understand why this imbalance in a relationship between these two entities eventually creates a situation of underdevelopment, because it is never in the interests of the world of colonialism for the periphery to change its position. And then I want to talk about the one thing that kind of comes up when you talk about colonialism, is that critics would want to say, for instance, colonialism is something that happened a long time ago. For instance, here in Africa, when you have Pan-Africanism in the 50s, it's like where a territorial colonialism starts to end, And so I think in the minds of many sort of liberated nations, it's like we start to think, it's like, what is the relevance of talking about colonialism today if it is obviously something that's behind us? And this is what brings me to like coloniality. And coloniality is pretty much a definition, as I understand it, that talks about how these instantiations of power from colonialism continue to perpetuate themselves today. And one of the things that we can think about is that you look at the extractive kind of relationship between colonies and metropoles in colonialism, and then you look at a situation like this where this is a construction of Congo Ocean Railway in the 1930s. And what you see there is obviously human labor, exploitation of natural environment, and this is being used to build a railway that goes to the port to facilitate the extraction of minerals. Now this is a more modern picture of not the same site, but the same place, the same site, the Congo. And this is a cobalt mine where, of course, human labor is being exploited in order to mine resources that are then transported to Europe. So coloniality, in a way, in terms, reifies that the sort of imbalance in relationships between a metropole and a colony haven't changed very much, even after these countries became liberated. And so I just kind of want to say that, of course, like colonialism and its vestige, the sort of reverberation of colonialism through time, as I understand it, manifests into two different ways. Of course, the one is the very material sense that, you know, there is a extraction and an exploitation of resources. And the second one is more epistemic. And epistemic referring to ideas of like who gets to create knowledge and who gets to define how we know the world, or how we know being, how we sort of define a state of being. So the epistemic, has to do more with like the more knowledge production and understanding the world and the ontology of which we relate to things. And I think in there's also gender and these other components. So maybe to give the idea of like the material example is like to talk about the life cycle of a laptop, you know, and I'll just kind of breeze through this quite quickly, is that in the material sense you have design and demand coming from the core. So appetites coming from the core and designers framing what the solutions or how to service those needs and those cores. This is coming from the core, which we can relate to the West today. And then you have a sourcing and supply of minerals like cobalt, of things like coltan that go into your cell phone and that go into your laptop and that go into creating Teslas. And those are mined from the periphery. Those are also assembled in the periphery in places like China, where electronic devices are assembled, but they are consumed again in the core. And then finally, after they're consumed in the core, they're sent back to the periphery for disposal. And so I think in terms about like continuing this thread about talking about coloniality, we can see through a story like this how colonialism still perpetuates itself with, you know, within the value streams that we have today, and under a world order that we call capitalism, which in some case feels like an instantiation of or sort of microcosm of colonialism, but sometimes, and this is the only meme that I have in my presentation, by the way, this kind of like, you know, what is capitalism, what is colonialism, how are they different? And so, yeah, this is kind of like, just talking about how epistemic is related to ontology and ways of knowing. And the other ways epistemic, this epistemic sort of manifestation of colonialism plays on is in, at least what I believe, is in kind of race and technology. And in race and technology, you might think that, of course, racism, maybe I want to just double back and say, was part of the main doctrine that led to colonialism, because there had to be a justification of why the periphery is of a place of non-being, so that it can be exploited and that resources can be extracted and genocides can be perpetuated and things like that. So racism goes hand in hand with the colonial agenda, but we also still don't understand how, at least in terms of way of knowing and ways of being, how it relates between race and technology. And I guess maybe we want to look at something like the design of a circuit board. I can't remember I think it's von Neumann architecture, for those of you who are still in computer science. But I just know that the typical image of a computer is that you have a CPU, a central processing unit, and then you have other smaller parts that feed the CPU information, but the CPU ultimately makes sense of whatever is being computed. So in a way, when you look at the architecture to which the computer is built, when you look at the level of like the chips and the semiconductors, it perpetuates exactly that same type of thinking, right? That there has to be a master and then it has to be a slave. I mean, when you look at like how RAID setups in hard drives are set up, you have a master and then you have a bunch of slaves. And of course, it's no coincidence that even that terminology survives in the design of technology. And also, the other thing that you can think about is like the word robot. And this is probably a very widely cited sort of reference, is that the word robot is actually Czech for forced labor, servitude, like slavery, essentially. So even a word like robot is imbued with these conceptions of coloniality, colonialism, racism, and I think, although I didn't want this talk to be about how we can. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. And so the other. I mean, if I need to make another kind of like point as to why I would think that technology itself has a problem with colonialism, is that when you look at some of the greatest developments of technology that happened mostly in Britain and the United States, they happened during colonial periods. So it's happening during a time when certain people aren't allowed to vote, and people are not even sometimes do not qualify for a kind of humanity. And so it almost feels a bit naive to think that technology being developed around that timeline would not be colonial, even when the resources, of course, of many of those great inventions are created by people who are enabled by colonialism. The colonial apparatus funded a lot of these researchers. I mean, of course, we also know that World War II, the Cold War efforts for empire and for territory and for that sort of geopolitical motivation also had an influence on science and technology. And so then we come to the idea of like, then what is kind of decolonization? And decolonization is essentially a web of theories that use historical hindsight to explain the patterns of power that shape our intellectual, political, economic, and social world. And so decolonization is an attempt to remedy, sometimes reverse the effects of colonialism that we experience today. And another definition there would be refers to the intellectual, political, economic, and societal work concerned with the restoration of land and life following the end of the colonial periods. And this can be done at least in two different ways according to the large body of sort of research of decolonial theory, is that territorial decolonization, which is giving back the land, if you want me to summarize, and all other sort of conversations about sovereignty that are happening in people with ancestral land, like in New Zealand or even here in Namibia with the Ovaherero and the Nama, who have lost ancestral land, who wanted to return to them, and of course, or rather compensated. And so, yeah, these are kind of like some of the territorial decolonization efforts. And then there, of course, like the structural decolonizations, where it's more about how do we change ways of thinking from the colonial ways of thinking to the more to a more decolonial form of thinking. And to summarize that, that is, or at least in my view, and also in my experience with the Indigenous Knowledge Group at NASP, is essentially how can we center ways of knowing and ways of knowledge that come from the zone of being or the core or the West, and move those knowledge systems to the periphery. So how do we center marginalized people, their history, their ways of knowing, to start to create a new world? So I think that's a kind of summary of like the decolonial effort. And the other thing that I want to talk about also is kind of like this quote, right? That says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And this is from Mark Mushiva, Capitalist Realism, which is a really good book, and I would implore all of you to read it. But it also, this statement frames the inertia and the what can I say, the paralysis of thinking within the current colonial system, is that it's so ingrained in the way we think, the way we relate to each other, that it's almost impossible. It be easier for you to imagine a world outside of capitalism, sort of the end, a world, the world ending, than a world where there is no capitalism, right? Which is why we have so many doomsday movies. A world after tomorrow, Sharknado, all of these other things, is because there's a kind of conceptual block. And I think a lot of what decolonial work has to be just thinking about what alternative worlds can be. And this is what I'm going to get into in terms of what is decolonial technology. And I have to admit that there's no such thing. And I think it's sexy to say like decolonial technology, because of course it's taking things that are kind of like polar opposites and somehow merging them together, and there's a kind of conceptronica about that makes it appealing. But once we understand that technology is deeply colonial, we can also understand that the idea that you can have decolonial technology is going to take a lot more effort than what we're currently doing. But I think I call this talk about decolonial technology because I'm interested in thinking about what decolonial technology can be, rather than explicitly stating what it is or how it can be repurposed in order to do some of these things in terms of to repurpose and use for supporting decolonial efforts. And so when I think about decolonial technology, I at least think about something that will move us, anything in terms of thought or in terms of material technologies that will move us from where we are right now, which is white patriarchal capitalism, into the alternative, which is impossible to imagine, and currently which is undefined, you know? And so the first one that you often think about is fugitivity, the idea that some people don't want to live in capitalism and they want to escape capitalism. In the same way, in the 1800s, you had slaves working on the plantation, which were like microcosms of capitalism and extraction, and fleeing plantations to go and live in nature in these maroon communities like the Colombos in Brazil and the islands in Jamaica. So this fugitivity, this rejection of living within capitalism, how can decolonial technology aid fugitivity is a thing that I like to think about. The other one is subversion, you know. How can decolonial technology, or what constitutes or what will become decolonial technology, undermine power and authority of an established system and institution like capitalism or colonialism? The other one that's more dangerous that I've kind of also been reading around a lot is called acceleration. And the acceleration movement is one that suggests that because there is no alternative to capitalism, because it is so hard to cast off the yoke of capitalism, then perhaps we should just accelerate it. Because capitalism itself has internal corruptions that will make itself destruct, which is why in the capitalist period we've had so many crises, you know, Lehman Brothers, Great Depression, whatever you want to call it. There's internal crises, and how does technology, and this is more philosophical and artistic thinking, is that how do you aid technology that just accelerates capitalism so that, you know, it crashes and it burns and we can move through it. And then the other one is like education. And education is related to learning to recognize colonial continuities and using technology as a means to render the invisible visible, having people understand how it is because of certain histories why we have current socio-economic realities today. They didn't happen out of nowhere. They started during some version of like some sort of colonial event, and technology can help in visualizing that or making these sort of asymmetrical power dynamics known. And this is where I work, in this area where I work professionally right now, and I'll give some example of how we're doing that. The other one is speculation and futuring, you know. It's also because there's no other alternative, and this is what constitutes our complacency in capitalism. How can we speculate different worlds? How can we create different futures in order for people to move outside of a colonial mentality? And I think that was the success of a movie like Black Panther, you know, where you have this, the Golden City in Wakanda, where it's like a technological utopia, right? It's a kind of futuring, or it's a kind of speculation. What if there was an African country with highly advanced technology? And I think that idea, I can only tell you that that movie had more to do, or did more to move the social consciousness of people to think about breaking away from capitalism, or that other worlds are possible, than I think any paper on colonialism or philosophy that's out today, which is kind of like, you know, lends credence to the idea that we do need to future. And the way, some of the ways that we future is we create movies, we create video games that give some kind of approximation of what this alternative world can be. And I think this is what game engines are really good for, because game engines have rules. This is how enjoyment is cultivated in game engines, and they have real physical laws like physics. You know, in Unity or in Unreal, you can simulate physics, which make them compelling, which make them believable, which make them powerful, just like the Game of Thrones Westeros world building map. And then the other one that decolonial technology can be is indigenous knowledge systems, right? The idea of like saying to capitalism and to colonial ways of knowing that there can be a reverse tutelage and there can be reverse pedagogies. There are other ways of relating to the world. There are other ways of knowing because there were other ways before colonialism, and of course there can be. And so trying to approximate through oral traditions, what are different ways that we value things, that we relate to each other. And this is all, I believe, in indigenous knowledge systems. So like what I was saying is that this idea of fugitivity is really interesting for me. And as an artistic practice, this is kind of where I'm working right now, you know. And the idea, and some of you who are in the HGI courses and are doing like critical design, the idea of designing for people who are not there. I think you may just try to maybe entertain me for 1 second, is that most of user-centered design or any sort of human-centric design today wants to prioritize the user of today, people who are there now. But I think if you had to imagine and speculate the needs of, for instance, a runaway slave in the 1800s that is running away, and that person can be either a man or woman having different needs. Because you also create user stories and things like that, you know, in human-computer interaction. So if you were trying to create, for instance, a persona for a fugitive slave in the 1800s living under colonialism, and you said, I want to design for that ancestor, not like the person who's living in capitalism today, but I want to design for a fugitive slave. As a thought experiment and as a means of speculation, could it be interesting that you might find that the needs of that slave somehow mirror the conditions of a person living today? So even as a source of generative inspiration to design new technology, this idea of designing for ancestors or designing for people who are not there, for specters and ghosts, really intrigues me as as an inspiration. And I'll share with you a technology that I kind of thought about while I was riffing off this idea of like fugitivity and slaves running away from plantations. So, but before I want to talk about like education in terms of how we make colonial crimes visible or a colonial situation visible. I currently work for an organization which is called Forensic Architecture, and Forensic Architecture is a research agency based in Goldsmith University, and we have 2 offices. One is in the UK in London, and the other one is in Berlin. And what we do is like we investigate human rights violations committed by states, police actors, militaries, and corporations, and we work with NGOs and some stakeholders in order to make those kinds of crimes visible. And which brings me to a project that we currently have right now, is that we currently have a project that we're running that aims to understand the effects of colonialism in Namibia. And so I'm gonna play a video that shows some of the work that we do, but maybe before I play, and I'll probably be talking over the video, is I wanna say that a big part of our research around colonialism in Namibia is understanding the land situation, how people were displaced and dispossessed of ancestral land during a period of the genocide, so 1904 to 1908, and how we can work with people from those communities in order to rely on oral testimonies in reconstructing the Namibia of that time in order to understand how the colonial machine of that time was operating in perpetuating land theft and genocide. And we do that using various methods. So the video is going to play, and maybe I could talk over it. We do this by, we study these archival photos that you can get from the National Archives. And then we photo match them in geospatial environments that we get from Google or whatever source, you know. So Google and these other sources have terrain maps, which is why sometimes you can change your 3D when you go on Google search. You can change it so you can see the terrain, and then we use the terrain because Namibia has such distinct landscape in order to match some of those photos, those archival photos, spatially referencing them in the environment in order for us to understand where the photos were taken. And once we know where the photos were taken, we know how it used to be, and we know how it is now, or how it changed during the different times that we're there. Oh my Lord. I think my video is broken, so I'm gonna quickly play the video of our website to show more of what I'm talking about. And here, for instance, what we were doing is we were georeferencing these photos that we got from the National Archives to understand where were the ancestral homes of the Ovaherero around Waterberg before the genocide happened, and then looking at other archival photos in terms of things like police stations and like that would then later be built on top of where these lands would be. For instance, this is a police station that used to be a Ovaherero village. And by photo matching the landscape and these photos, we can then start to understand the events of that time. And also understand, I think, the tradition of the indigenous people that were there at that time. So this is basically a map showing where the different photos are and where we have kind of located those photos on a satellite map. And so this is a homestead. So a homestead used to be there. And in terms of reconstructing this homestead, I think this is us talking to one of our stakeholders in order for them to describe exactly how these homesteads look like before people were dispossessed and forcibly moved from that land. And we make models of huts and other kinds of structures using this testimony and this kind of like rapport with or kind of interviewing with our stakeholders, and then we place them in the environment. So this is happening in, I think this is happening in Unreal Engine. So doing things like changing textures of huts, creating new textures, using particle simulations to show elements like fire, for instance, you know, because when the Germans, I assume you all know about the Battle of Waterberg that happened, but it is specifically because the Ovaherero, they light certain fires as a matter of their tradition, And when the German forces were, of course, on the Waterberg before the attack, they were able to see where these fires were in order to, yeah. So, what else is there? There's not too much to see. Yeah, so this is kind of like a rendition in Unreal Engine that shows what I'm talking about, what it might have looked like for the Germans, so German soldiers during the night before the attack, as they saw where these fires might have been and where the camp and where the homesteads were. And of course we know where the homesteads were because we photo matched them and geo-reference them in those specific locations. And so that's a kind of example of like what we did or what we do during our investigation. So maybe I want to go on, if you're still with me, to just give some another example that we were thinking about is, of course, if that there's one thing about the disposition of land, but in terms of learning about what colonialism did and maybe understand the future of what the future effects of colonialism is, we want to understand what environmental effects did colonialism have during that period of 1904 to 1908, where there isn't like encroaching bush. And I want to say the phenomenon that we're studying is bush. And we're studying bush because in the conversation about reparation, if we say, okay, like we want to say decolonization is about some restitution of land or reparations for land theft and dispossession, how would you quantify, how much you need to, what's the word, pay, I guess, for the lack of a better word, how much would you have to pay? And in order to understand like the loss of value, in a way we also have to quantify how much the land has degraded. Because it's not the same if I take a garden from you and then I say 100 years from now and I say, okay, I'm going to give you a desert back. There are also certain elements of environmental impact that you have to consider when you think about something like that. This is what we call, we use a mixture of like analog and digital methods. So there's a process called repeat photography that early environmentalists within the colony of German Southwest Africa were doing, and it's called the repeat photography. So the idea is that you go to the same spot and you take a photo, and you take a photo at the same time in a different and then of course in a different and in the same season, different in a time series manner, different like progressions of years, to understand like this is that location in 1876 and this is that location in 2006. But now, in order to say, of course, is this colonialism, you need to understand how land is land boundaries, right? Because whose land is this right now? Is this indigenous land, or is this commercial land today that may have been appropriated through the land theft or the genocide? And the biggest thing that we see in Namibia, at least, is farm boundaries. This is what the farm boundaries look like in 1897. So by studying these archival maps, we can see that from the plans that the colonial administration were using, is that the yellow is what was constituted as communal land, and the red is what essentially were European farms. And that was in 1897. This is what it starts to look like in 1902. So we start seeing a progression of European farms over a gradient of central Namibia, which is kind of like central Namibia. I won't get the chance to show some of the other stuff, but that area is where the most like high rainfall, fertile grazing land is. So that's what it looks like in 1911. And this is after the genocide. You see a really drastic spike in European land ownership after the events of 1904 and 1908, which we say 1906, which we say is during the time of the genocide. And then this is what it looks like in 1921. So people are starting to be concentrated in what is known as ethnic homelands. And then this is what it starts to look like in 1964. I mean, mind you that during this time, the administration had changed. It is no longer German, but the instantiation of those boundaries continue from, of course, the short time of German colonialism to the longer period of South African apartheid administration. And I think this is what the map looks like. So you have 40%, round about 40% of European farm territory of people who are 0.3% of the population inhabiting that land. And this is from 2021, so I think we are kind of safe to assume that this is pretty much how it looks like today. And I think you can also confirm that from more objective sources like newspapers and stuff like that. So the other thing that we do is we try to go in like environments like Blender, for instance, in terms of to reconstruct the environment. So now that we have this historical photo, how can we create the density of that historical photo? Because the photo is obviously 2D and we want to understand the biomass of trees. And so we kind of have to overlay the archival photo over the same area where the photo was taken, using the landscape range or the mountain range as our kind of like our sort of matching process, right? In order to then reconstruct the tree density from the photographs and then understand how the land has changed. I think here it gives you more of a more understandable, legible example. Yeah, so this is part of the research we're doing right now to understand the effects on the environment. And just like the other example we had, we also work with the oral testimonies of the affected groups in order to reconstruct a landscape, in order to find out, okay, this area used to be full of trees, or this area used to be full of grasslands for animals, and but now it is barren. So it is also part of the reconstruction process. And we also have a library of we create library and we model. Sometimes we model these specific tree species with environmentalists so that when we place them in the game engine, we can get the right tree, because different trees have different densities. Another thing that we do is in order to understand the changes of landscape, we also rely on these aerial photos. Like these photos, for instance, are photos of Okakarara from the 1960s. So we want to understand the progression of certain kinds of vegetation, like we said, bush, because bush encroachment is the marker of land degradation. We take a grayscale image aerial photo like that. We run it through a machine learning software in order to colorize it, and then we geolocate it on the exact kind of like parameter that it occupies on a real satellite map. And then after that, we use Google Earth Engine in order to run machine learning classifiers. And what the machine learning classifiers can do is that we can train them in order for them to classify correctly what types of land cover you see in the picture. So in this picture, of course, you don't know what is ground, and you don't know what is bush, and you don't know what is water, because it's like grayscale, black and white. But the minute you color it with the machine learning algorithm using grayscale clustering, and then you run different pre-trained classifiers to take that same photo and say, okay, this is grass, this is bush, this is tar road, and these kinds of things. And then you start to get a more, if you have a progression of those photos going over time, you can see the progression of different kinds of land cover. Essentially, is the thesis that we're using Google Earth Engine. Because Google Earth Engine as a spatial computational tool is very powerful. You can calculate the amount of bush, the amount of moisture in trees based on satellite photos. But of course, for the specific period that we're looking at, there are no satellite photos, so we have to use machine learning to create impressions of what the landscape would look like. This is, for instance, an example that you can see about Horncrux in 1967 and the classifier figuring out like what is what part of the land, what is what in that landscape, or what is the same and what is different. And then, of course, in the console, I don't know how many people are encoding here, but you get readouts of like, okay, this color is associated with this kind of land cover classification. And then you have other things where we use statistical projection to say, we're going to study different data sources. Some of that data comes from the food and, is it FAO, like the Food and Agriculture Organization. And then we use projection maps, statistical projection maps, to calculate the trends of land cover in contemporary times. And then we use some form of like regression analysis to show in 1899 what might have been the land cover classes within that area. And the borders that we're seeing right now, the reds are where commercial farms are today. For instance, Ochiseve is a commercial farm. And the yellow forms what is kind of called communal land, you know, which is kind of like, you know, becomes the Bantu stands, and then becomes what are the reserves of our communal lands today. And then this just shows a progression of how it goes from 1899 to something like 2019. So essentially creating a data set for a time when there is no data, let's say, satellite data to show. Because I think the most noticeable difference that you can see is that the green pixels, which are pixels of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, are disappearing. And this is what we've confirmed with environmentalists to be the disappearance of healthy savanna forests. Whether that is taking place mostly on what is now European farms, or what is taking place more on communal farms, is kind of something that we are kind of like developing. So that was part of the education, and maybe I just wanna just rush through the ideas of speculation. So in terms of fugitivity, this is a device that I'm working on right now, which essentially uses machine learning running on a Raspberry Pi and a display in order to, the camera detects whatever is in the room, whoever's in the room, recognize them, then is able to show me on a small screen what it's detecting. So I was thinking, in the spirit of fugitivity, if, for instance, people of color are being surveilled or extra surveilled by security systems today? Can there be a form of counter-surveillance? Can we have community-run databases or data sets where we register, certain, the idea is actually quite crazy. Because a community-run database where we register racist offenders. And then, you know what I'm saying? So when you're wearing the HMD and you're going around, and if you see this guy serving you coffee, and it detects his face and shows you like, yo, this is the guy, this is the guy that did that. So, yeah, it's kind of like, this idea of fugitivity and counter-surveillance, But this is kind of what I think decolonial technology can be. Of course, it has its own problems if you really want to get down to it. But this is actually something that I did locally with the Omeho project. The Omeho project, and basically what we were doing is like, we consulted something like, I don't know if it was Auri, maybe 20 or something Herero youth in order to co-design an Instagram filter, right? And what we did there is like we 3D scanned like the Ochikaiva, which is the traditional Herero headdress, and then we created a filter for it that that they could use in trying to figure out like, how can we create these kinds of 3D assets so that there are other ways of looking beautiful, and which is also part of the decolonial agenda of like decolonizing beauty, because beauty is usually a tiara or something more Eurocentric. And then, so this was a tangible thing that we created, but then it's also something that we use in a film that I'm showing next week, but showing as an asset in an alternate universe, some alternate world in Namibia somewhere, where people wear these 3D holograms, but the 3D holograms are holograms of the Ochikaiva. So that's kind of part of this futuring and speculation angle. These are just some of the tools that I use for my work, and I'm happy to chat with some of you after to talk about exactly how I use these tools. Processing, you guys might recognize Zenda, 3JS for mostly 3D work that happens in browser, Unity, which is a game engine, and then QGIS for more sort of cartographic analysis. And I was actually hoping that I could, as a closing thing, that I could show a tech demo of something that I worked on a couple of years called Mbako. So I'm just going to try set it up quickly, and then I really don't know if it's going to work because we spent like 3 days out in the desert, like shooting with it, so it might be a bit like not behaving. So, but I'm just going to try set it up. So most of the parts here are, actually all the parts are made from like open source stuff. So most of it is 3D printed and soldered. So all stuff you can get off like Amazon or I think it's kind of shrunk because of the heat. Maybe I can take my hand in there. So this is kind of like, it's called Mbako, which means speaker or microphone in Oshuambo. But basically I made it because, like rappers and poets, they use their hands a lot. But I think most musicians look down on rappers because they say like they don't actually play any instruments, but they use their hands a lot. So I thought, what if you created like an instrument that uses the movement of the fingers to sonify sound, to like make sounds and stuff. So I'm gonna try and hook it up and see if we can get some sound coming out of it. Yeah, I just do this weird ritual because the EMU or the gyroscope needs to figure out what's up, down, left, right, and drawing these kinds of figure eights like help it to properly calibrate, because once it properly calibrates, then that means like the gestures of my hands can properly influence the sound. Is there a way we can turn the volume up? Yeah, so I think that's, I won't play like a full song or whatever, so just to demonstrate. So yeah, yeah, so that concludes my presentation about like decolonial technology and aspects of futuring and speculation. And yeah, I mean, if you're interested in seeing more of the work, you can check out those websites, stuff from the Decolonial Technology part, and then part of also what forensic architecture does. Yeah, so